Hi APUSH students. Here is an overview of the chapters that are going to be on Thursday's test. Chapters 31, 32, 33, and 34. Chapter 31 is going to start with Truman. It's going to go into his domestic and foreign policy. He is the first president to be in office when we began the Cold War. So it's going to go through his containment policy for foreign policy in the Korean War, which takes place during his presidency. It's also going to talk a little bit about the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which Truman vetoes, but Congress overrides his veto, and Truman's Fair Deal, which was an attempt to continue and expand on the New Deal, which FDR had started. Unfortunately, because in the 1946 midterm elections, Congress had won, so Republicans had won both houses of Congress. As a Democrat, Truman didn't have a lot going for him, and so he nicknamed them the Do-Nothing Congress, so a lot of his legislation didn't pass at this time, although he was successfully able to integrate the military in 1948. He also passes the GI Bill, that was in 1944, which is going to have a big impact on the baby boom generation. So Truman, Democrat. His domestic policy is the Fair Deal. Foreign policy is containment. He is president during the Korean War. We then have Eisenhower, who wins the election of 1952. He is a Republican. He is going to have a domestic policy known as dynamic conservatism. So he's not going to get rid of any of the more social welfare type programs that were implemented by the New Deal and the Fair Deal, but he is much more conservative when it comes to the government. So he doesn't want the government spending a lot. He also has a different idea about foreign policy. Rather than Truman, who preferred to contain communism where it was behind the Iron Curtain, he is going to want to build our arsenal or our nuclear weapons rather than our conventional forces. So he was our prized general in World War II with Operation Torch and D-Day. So as a military man, he felt it was more beneficial to pump our money into improving our technological innovations for warfare. And then what his Secretary of State had coined brinksmanship or massive retaliation, bring your enemy to the brink of war and then threaten mass destruction. So he didn't really get a lot of opportunity to implement this policy. There were revolts in Hungary, which you can't really threaten mass destruction when communism is going on in another country with a lot of innocent people. Another big thing under Eisenhower is going to be the Suez Crisis in 1956, which is going to lead to passage of the Eisenhower Doctrine. We'll go more into that when we actually go have our lesson. So Eisenhower wins the re-election again in 1956. He is going to continue his modern Republican type legislation. He is going to be in office when Sputnik is launched, and because we're mad that the Soviets beat us in the space race, he is going to start NASA. He's also going to pump a lot more money into science and mathematics for education. So Eisenhower is a Republican. His foreign policy is known as brinksmanship or massive retaliation. He is president during the Suez Crisis. He is also president when Sputnik is launched, and so he creates NASA. In the election of 1960, Eisenhower's former vice president runs against the Democratic candidate, John F. Kennedy. This is the first election where televised debates debut, which is really going to help Kennedy, not so much Nixon. Nixon, if we remember, had already been on TV a few years before when he gave the Checkers speech. So Nixon is not going to do as well. In the election of 1960, JFK wins by a landslide. More people vote than ever before. And once he comes to office, he has what is known as the New Frontier. So he is going to offer programs to help women, to bring in more jobs, to not really civil rights. He's not that open with civil rights. But he is going to have new ideas for education, for women, for jobs, for space. He's kind of like a compromise between Truman and Eisenhower in terms of foreign policy. He has what's known as flexible response, where he thinks it's important to build up conventional forces, but it's also important to pump money into your arsenal or your nuclear weapons and technologies and research for that. He is going to take office he's elected in 1960. When he takes office, one of the first things that happens is the Bay of Pigs. So under Truman, the CIA was started. Eisenhower utilized covert CIA operations a lot during his presidency around 1954-ish, 1953, 54 in Iran and Guatemala. So while Eisenhower was president, the CIA had planned the Bay of Pigs. Cuba had fallen to communism in 1959, and there was a group of expatriates who had come here, and the CIA trained them, and the goal was for them to go back to Cuba to overthrow Castro. It ends up being a huge failure, and it takes place during Kennedy's presidency. So he is what I think is the good guy, and he takes the blame for it. And he definitely does redeem himself, but that's one of the first things that happens in his office. The next thing to know for Kennedy is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is going to happen that next year in 1962. Between the last time and this time for foreign policy, Stalin has now died, Khrushchev takes over, and he is going to be the one in power during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we find out that the Soviets they have missiles in Cuba, which is in shooting range of our country. It was also in range of, I think, the Panama Canal, they said. And so it was the most imminent threat of nuclear destruction that we had experienced up until this point. There ends up being, I guess, a felicitous discrepancy in terms of communication. And when we're silent in response to Khrushchev takes it as we're getting ready to attack. So he does remove the missiles. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are a couple of things that are signed. There's also a hotline that's set up between the leaders, Khrushchev and our president, so that if something like that were to happen again, we could be in direct communication. Okay, so quick recap. We've had Truman, who's a Democrat, Eisenhower, Republican, Kennedy, who's a Democrat. With Kennedy, what is going to happen is he does a lot at home, he does a lot abroad, but unfortunately, he is going to be assassinated in 1963. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is going to take over for him. So at first, he's going to continue the legacy that JFK had left behind. Then there's an election in 1964. Lyndon B. Johnson runs as the Democratic candidate, and he wins that election. Once he is in office, he's going to launch his Great Society and his War on Poverty. Lyndon B. Johnson I feel like he kind of got the short end of the stick because essentially he did want to help people, do more for people, but wrong place, wrong time. He's the president when Vietnam takes place. With LBJ, with his Great Society and his War on Poverty, there are a lot of things that he passed that we still have today, like VISTA, Head Start, Medicaid, Medicare. So he initiated a lot more government-funded welfare, which was very similar to the New Deal. With kind of hand in hand with his attempts to help our community, our society, American people, there's something that happens in Vietnam, in French Indochina. I think it's around, I want to say 1954. So it's when Eisenhower is president, but the French are defeated at Bien Dien Phu, and we lose what was originally the French colonized holdings in Indochina. Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel, and that's going to set the stage for what's going to happen later. So in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is going to allow and formally recognize the right to intervene in Vietnam, which is going to be the beginning of the Vietnam War, which is going to be more of next unit for APUSH students when we learn about the counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s. So to kind of give a brief recap of what I just talked about, we have a graphic organizer. Hopefully everyone can see that. But we're going to start in 1944, go through Truman's presidency. We're going to go through Eisenhower's presidency, Kennedy's presidency, and then Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. So out of our 4 presidents, Eisenhower is the only Republican. Going along with this time period, there are some other, not necessarily political or foreign policy issues, but there are some other things going on. So in the 1950s, because of the GI Bill, which was passed by Truman in 1944, in conjunction with the Interstate Highway Act passed by Eisenhower, we have the perfect recipe for the baby boom generation. So we're going to have growth of suburbs, Levitt towns, growth of consumer culture, conformity. We have women taking more of a traditional gender role, staying in the home. We have catalogs, new innovations to help with household work. So for culture-wise, we have what becomes known as the affluent society. We also have during this time period the civil rights movement. So one of the most important court cases ever is going to be Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. It's going to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson, which said separate but equal. So with Brown v. Board of Education, we're now going to integrate public schools. This is happening at the same time that civil rights is kind of picking up. So we do have a slew of civil rights acts. This is when we have MLK, Rosa Parks, Stokely Carmichael, all of the different organizations working toward and for the civil rights movement. We also have the most liberal Supreme Court justice who was elected to the Supreme Court. Under the Earl Warren Court, there is a huge extension of civil liberties. So we're going to have like Baker v. Carr, Engel v. Vattel, I think that's what it is. And probably the one that's most known, which is Miranda v. Arizona, with having the right to remain silent, what you say and do can be held against you, blah, blah, blah. So we do have a lot that's going on in this time period. Let me get one more graphic organizer. So we have the Cold War going on at this time, which hopefully everyone can see that, which is an extended period of tension between the U.S. and the USSR. We have 4 presidents, U.S. presidents, during this time frame. We have the civil rights movement going on, desegregation of the military, Brown v. Board of Education, MLK, March on Washington, the whole shebang. We have this new culture that's kind of coming about with TV, suburbs, and the baby boom generation. So through this time frame that we just talked about, it's going to set in motion and set the stage for, in 1968, Nixon is going to win. He is also a Republican. Remember, he was Eisenhower's vice president, gave the Checkers speech, which is then going to segue into the Watergate crisis, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and everyone else up until our current president. So I hope that helped. I hope that was a good brief recap of the Cold War. And, yep, that's it.